Is it legal to hire a private investigator? Sounds like a simple question, right? And it is. And simple questions deserve simple answers. So the simple answer to the question, is it legal to hire a private investigator, is simply yes. At least in the United States anyway, it is legal to hire a PI in all 50 states. But there is more to it. So let's take a deeper dive. So before hiring a private investigator, you need to understand the risks involved in hiring a private investigator. Be cautious. Don't just jump in head first. First of all, there are difficulties in obtaining certain facts. This is something a lot of people don't realize when they're talking with a private investigator. They might be hiring them to go out and do surveillance on an infidelity case. They think their spouse is cheating on them. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? You send somebody out in a car, they sit down the street, they wait for her or him to leave, they follow them to the bar, they go in, they snap some pictures, and the case is closed. Well, it's not that simple. Trust me, I've had a lot of cases like that. My company has done a lot of these types of cases, and it's never as easy as it seems. In fact, many times it can be very difficult to obtain those facts, that evidence that the client expects. Now, I've made a list of the top 10 risks that you need to consider when you're hiring a private investigator. Now, the first and the biggest problem that I often see is when somebody hires the wrong private investigator. This video is sponsored by OREP Insurance and Working PI Magazine. OREP is a leading provider of private investigator liability insurance. Visit orep.org for a quote today. Yep, this happens all the time. They will hire somebody that does not exactly specialize in the area that they need. For instance, they may hire somebody that does mostly surveillance, but they hire them to go out and do an accident investigation or a DUI criminal defense investigation. Can they do some of it? Yeah, but the key word there is they can do some of it. They are not experts at doing all of it. And then there's some PIs that just plain work in what we'll call gray areas. They may do things that may or may not be legal just to get the job done. If you're asking your PI to do something and you think it may not be right, and they say, yes, we're going to do that, then you probably need to ask them, is it legal for you to do that? In fact, I usually recommend, no matter what the PI recommends, is ask them on each of those, is it legal for you to do that? Have you ever been challenged for doing that before? Because if they're off working in some gray area and it gets challenged in court, not only is it going to go back on the PI, it's going to go back on the client as well. The biggest thing is if something feels wrong, something probably is wrong. If it doesn't feel right, you may not have the right private investigator. Now, the second big risk you have to worry about is getting your money's worth. You see, low cost is not always the best thing when hiring a private investigator. I get a lot of calls where people say, I was talking to such and such a company, or I talked to these people and they'll do it for that price. And I always tell them, well, if money is your only concern, then that might be the best option for you. But let me tell you what we can offer you. And private investigators need to keep this in mind too. If you are trying to be the lowball guy out there, then you are really going to be the bottom feeder out there. You're not going to get the good cases. You're going to get more of the problem clients too, because they're the ones just looking for the most for the least, and that's going to create a lot of issues. Now, if you're looking for a private investigator and you're doing your due diligence and you're talking to 3, 4, 5 or more private investigators, you are going to get a variety of bids and quotes. Some of those PIs are going to charge by the hour. Some are going to have a flat rate. Some are going to require a retainer. You need to know each of these things so you can compare apples to apples. I always suggest to try to get a quote for the entire job. They're usually then going to want a retainer for that quoted amount, but now you're going to know what it's going to cost. If they just quote an hourly fee, Mr. Customer, absolutely, I can get started on that. We charge $50 an hour. Does that work for you? Well, that is probably a reason to be concerned right there. They should be formulating a plan and formulating a quote that fits your particular needs. The third big risk out there is when the PI starts telling you, the customer, what you want to hear. You see, most PIs are very good listeners, and they are very good at doing this, at listening to what you're saying so they can get the job. Now, if they're just agreeing with everything you say, you need to be a little cautious about that. A lot of times they'll just tell you what you want to hear. If they're just saying, yep, we'll go out and do that. Yep, we'll go out and get that. Yep, we'll go out and do this. And they're not telling you about the risks of the case, about the difficulties of the case, then there's probably something to be worried about there. Again, they should be formulating a plan that fits your particular situation and your particular case. Now, here is another big risk, and that's no guarantees. Private investigators cannot guarantee anything. If they do guarantee, or it sounds like they're going to guarantee something, then you probably need to be a little cautious there. You see, in most states, it is against the law for them to guarantee an outcome. In fact, private investigators, for the most part, cannot even work on contingency basis. So if they come back and they say, well, we guarantee that we're going to get the goods on your husband, or we're going to get the goods on your wife, or we're going to, prove exactly what you want proved, then you probably need to be very cautious there. Now, here's a huge one, and that's PI licensing. Most states have licensing. But in those states, there are always a lot of people out there working in the PI profession that are not licensed. Now, here in Colorado, we used to have licensing. Thanks to our governor and his infinite wisdom, he did away with our licensing. I don't agree with his take on it, but he did it anyway. But anyway, when we had licensing, we had a lot of unlicensed people out there working in the PI field anyway. So make sure you ask them if they are licensed. Get their PI license number. You want to get that, and you want to verify that on the state's website and check to see if they have any complaints. And remember, no complaints only means that there were no complaints filed. It doesn't mean that they're a great private investigator. And if they don't have licensing, you probably really need to worry about why. Well, first of all, if you're in a state where they require licensing and they don't have licensing, then everything they go out and do for you in an investigation probably is not legal, probably cannot even be admitted in court. And I've seen it, unfortunately, a lot of times when there are the unlicensed people, they are the ones that are really the people ripping people off. And if you're in a state that doesn't have licensing, and there's only a handful of states that don't have licensing, then you need to ask them why they aren't licensed. Most PIs, or at least most credible PIs, will be licensed in a neighboring state. Now, another risk that you need to be careful about is the PI not being dependable. And this one's really hard to discern. It's hard to tell if they are dependable. You call them, they answer the phone, you assume they're dependable. I always suggest to do some small tests, like set up a follow-up appointment or set up a follow-up phone call with them and see if they meet all the criteria of that and meet on time. Another risk of hiring a private investigator is the lack of expertise. We kind of touched base on this a little bit before. Make sure they are qualified to do the work for your case. Again, you don't want to hire somebody that does a lot of surveillance to do a criminal defense case. And you don't want to hire somebody that does criminal defense all the time to go out and do workers' comp surveillance necessarily. So I often say ask for references, but be careful here because most PIs aren't able to give out a lot of references. I know most of my clients do not want the world to know that they hired a private investigator. But you can also ask for proof of their education. If they say that they are certified in this or we went to school for that, then ask for proof of that education. And here's a big one too. Be an investigator yourself. Ask probing questions about previous work that they've done. And if they sound like they're wavering on things, if they sound like they're not able to just give you clear answers and descriptions of jobs that they've worked, you might want to take that into consideration. Now, another risk of hiring a private investigator is the lack of evidence that they may produce. You need to understand you may not get the evidence that you suspect is out there. This happens a lot. I tell you, a lot of times, especially with infidelity. So many times we'll go out on a surveillance and he is sure that she's going to go out at 6 o'clock with Billy Joe Bob, the person that he thinks she's cheating with, and nobody ever shows up. And maybe it just wasn't that night, or maybe they got suspicious and so they called off their rendezvous, or whatever. Maybe they got in a little fight, a little tiff, and she never met with her boyfriend. But it happens a lot that it just doesn't work out the way the client initially expected. So given that, you need to be prepared for the PI to ask for more financial resources. If they go out and they do the surveillance and nothing happens and you only hired them for 4 hours, they may have to come back and say, well, we can try it again next week or next month or whatever. That is why I prefer to present a full case to a client. We can go out and we can do surveillance for 3 times or 2 times, and this is what it's going to cost. Then when we go out, if nothing occurs, we can just automatically schedule that next occurrence. And here's something else about that too. A lot of times seeing something happen once doesn't prove anything. If you follow her husband over to some woman's house, he could just say, I was going over there to visit an old friend and console her because she was going through a divorce. But if you follow him over to her house every Friday evening for 3 consecutive weeks and a couple of days at lunchtime, he leaves work and he goes there, well, now you're showing a habit, a pattern of habits. Now, another risk that you take when you hire a private investigator is them getting caught red-handed. And this is possible with any case, especially with surveillance, but it can be with other investigations too. How do they handle this type of a situation? And you should ask them, if you get burned on surveillance, what are you going to do? If my husband starts acting suspicious while you're following, what are you going to do? And this can happen on surveillances, whether you're doing interviews, scene photographs, just about any case. Another big risk is the wrong scope for the PI. Many PIs only do so much. Be aware, if they offer something that you don't think is what you need, then you probably need to talk to them about it or look for somebody else. An example is if you are looking for somebody to help you with a criminal defense case and they keep talking about doing surveillance, well, that scope is kind of out of the norm for a criminal defense case. I have had some criminal defense cases where I've done surveillance, but not everyone, to be sure, and not that often. Now, if you want to know more about what private investigators can and cannot do, then check out this video.